for questions. I want to introduce our open house chair, Randy Deere with Waxahachie Toastmasters. Randy has had some definite success, and we want to share some of those tips with you. Please welcome Randy.
Thank you so much, Christy. I'm excited to be here this evening. For many of us, this year has provided us with some unique opportunities of how we go about adapting to a virtual environment. How can you go about hosting an open house in a virtual environment? We have had the opportunity, but many of us have adapted to Zoom. I know there's other platforms that are out there that are being used in the district, but many of us are leveraging Zoom. And that provides a platform where you can allow people to register for the meeting itself. So if you want to host an open house, one of those great starting tools is Zoom having its own registration that you can assign with the meeting. And that will allow your guests to sign up so you have their contact information. And then it will also allow an opportunity for you to follow up because you have that contact information from the guests. At the time that they use that Zoom registration, they'll be given the meeting ID, the password, and for those that use a URL, that'll also be provided. So it's a great way to manage that information and not have that out shared publicly. If you choose not to use the Zoom registration, then one of the things that I would highly recommend to consider when you're hosting an open house would be a sign-in sheet. So similar to if you were hosting an open house in person, where you would have guests to sign in and you get their contact information, you could have a virtual sign-in sheet. So Google Docs, Google Forms, there's many tools that are out there where you can collect their information so that you're able to follow up with your guests after the meeting. Depending upon how they found out about the meeting, whether it was from a friend of a friend of a friend, or you directly invited them, that sign-in sheet is a great way to know who attended your meeting, especially in situations where you allow people to join a meeting without having to have a Zoom account. And in those cases, when you end the meeting, you don't know who your attendees are. We found that out through an open house. We'd lowered the security settings to make it as simple as possible. The flip side was we didn't know who a couple of our guests were. So that was a takeaway for us, was to make sure that we had a methodology that we got that information from everybody. And again, there's templates that are out on our open house kit on our website that walk through how to set up the open house registration for Zoom. There's also an example for a sign-up sheet. And then there's also an example for a follow-up letter. For many of us, when we would have guests in person, we might give them a guest packet. We'd hand them a physical packet, a folder, a letter from the president, some materials, but now we're in a virtual environment and we still want to have a way to follow up with our guests. So one of the things that we've done is we've provided an example in the open house kit of a letter that you could be able to copy and paste and share with your guests after the meeting. It contains links to a membership application, benefits of membership. You have the ability, of course, to customize it in a way that sounds authentic for your club, but it's a good starting point for you as you're getting ready to go through this journey of being able to connect with your guests, get them into the meeting and then following up with them after the meeting itself. Similar to any Toastmasters meeting, we have an agenda that we would prepare for our guests. We have our standard templates that Toastmaster has provided to us. If you have guests that have pre-registered, then you'll have their email address, and that's a great way to be able to email them that ahead of the meeting so they have some familiarity with what's going on. Also, being in a virtual environment, just like we're sharing the screen right now, you could also share a prepared agenda. An open house is just like a regular meeting. It's a little more advertising. Hopefully you spent a little extra time in your meeting to be able to allow for interaction with your guests, but you're still going to want to have a prepared agenda to help them understand how we navigate a Toastmasters meeting. For those who may be aware, may or may not be aware, Toastmasters also has some Zoom virtual background. So similar to how I have an open house behind me, there is also timer backgrounds that are available from the Toastmasters website, and we also have links to that in our Zoom toolkit for open houses. And that allows you some functionality. Now, not all computers or devices can utilize those timer backgrounds, but that is a great tool for many of us. When we all had the pleasure of going home earlier this year, the Sergeant at Arms went home with the kit that we had for our club. So we're not all sitting around with these green, yellow, and red sheets just ready to go. So this is a great resource that's available to be able to use in an open house as well as in a virtual setting. And I share this for this example of just being able to adapt. And so it's finding those tools that the different role holders in your meeting would want to leverage in a virtual environment. For many of us, we've been meeting for a while in a virtual environment and we found ways to do it. For some people, you're just getting started back up meeting and want to understand that there are resources out there from that perspective. The other thing I would share from hosting an open house is considering your helpers. So similar to a contest where we might have a senior sergeant at arm and a second sergeant at arm to be able to help and facilitate, it's understanding those roles. So if I'm asking as the Toastmaster of the day, it would be super helpful if I had someone who was really comfortable in a Zoom environment to be able to take on that role as a sergeant at arms, even if my club sergeant at arms wasn't as confident in Zoom, maybe borrowing a friend from another club or reaching out within the district to understand what are those types of roles to have. I also say in a setting like this where we have a large number of people, it's easy for our guests to sometimes feel a little lost. I'm one of 33 participants in the meeting right now. So I may not be connecting with Brandy in the same way I would if I was sitting in person. I could walk up to Lou and say, "Hi, Lou, how are you doing?" So having someone who's there who could potentially be your VP of membership, someone who's just a really great social person who's designated to just be able to send a private chat to say, "Hey, Lou, thanks for coming tonight. We're excited to have you." It's just that greeter, that someone to connect with your members while the meeting itself is going on. One of the things that we've had to adapt from for many of this year is just thinking about how do we approach advertising our open house. For a lot of us in the past, we would create a flyer and when we go to our favorite locations around town and we would post those flyers and we would be able to attract people to show up. In many areas today, we're still at home. Those interactions outside of our little houses, is it the same? We would run it in and out of stores. We're not necessarily looking around the bulletin boards and places like that where we might have in the past. So it's understanding those resources that are available to us to help us to advertise. Similar to pre-COVID, we had the ability to do press releases, and there's a standard template that Toastmasters has available. Most of the newspapers today also have an online presence. So if you leverage a press release, most of the newspapers would publish that for free. So that's a great resource to be able to consider is facilitating a press release. Additionally, Toastmasters offers a social media flyer. Now, certainly you can come up with your own custom graphic to be able to advertise your event on social media. But for many of us that may be, 2 steps down the road and we're not quite there for that yet. So having that tool is a great resource that's out there. In the standard flyers that we would put out there when we're talking about a virtual event, you'd like to be able to provide that URL with them. Look at the URL for a Toastmasters meeting, you'll notice that many times that URL is 52 characters. If I'm having to manually type that in from a flyer, I'm likely going to get lost or make a mistake. So one of those tools that is available to us is shortening a URL. So you can take that 52 characters and you can make it much shorter. So there are tools like Bitly that are out there that will help you to get a shorter URL. And we have a link to that in our open house kit to talk through how to set that up. And again, that's also a great tool, especially if you were going to do something like a newspaper That would be another place as well that you might want to have that shorter UL, something that people could actually, read off and be able to type in, that it isn't so lengthy that people are taken back from being able to approach that. One of the best ways I would say for advertising is the people in your club. Those are your best resources. How your members can help is one of the best tools for you. In today's environment, we have so many resources available to us to connect, just like we're connecting tonight through Zoom from our homes, the place of business. What I say in asking your members to help is make it simple. Come up with messages that they could pass along to people in a format that makes sense. So if you want to send a message for them to share through text, similar to a tweet that you're putting out there, you'd want to keep it short, something brief that they're able to share with friends, family, and coworkers. Same philosophy of coming up with a message that would be specific in an email campaign that they're able to forward to friends and colleagues. In an email, I would say this is something to think about. Are you going to require them to pre-register using a Zoom registration or something like a Sign Up Genius? If so, then you'll want to include that in there. If you don't require pre-registration for the meeting, if you just allow them to forward it with the meeting details, then I would definitely encourage you to consider a sign-up sheet, because if people are passing along those Zoom details, then when your guests show up for the meeting, that you won't be able to have that contact information from them to follow up after the meeting itself. And then the other thing I'd say is, if your club has social media, whatever those platforms may be, encourage your members to help you out. If they're active on social media, have them to retweet, to like, to share, to comment, to be engaged in that. If they're engaged on social media, have them to copy and share that. If they're in a mom's group or whatever that group may be on a social media platform, to be able to reshare that as appropriate, to take that message and pass it along to people who might not have otherwise seen that message, as a way to be engaged. Toastmasters has said over and over again that members are the best resources to get the message out. So in lieu of giving them a flyer, think about some different approaches that you might be able to help them with setting up, so they could easily just click forward on an email message, and then they're ready to be able to share the news about the open house.
Okay, well, this is a point where I don't want to interrupt Brandy, but I think this is a point where I want to interject here, that one of the best things that you may or may not have picked up on is that we have examples of all of the things that Brandy talked about. The examples are out there on the D50 website. Go to the d50tm.org, just like it's been, District 50 Toastmasters.org for short, d50tm.org. Under club-growth, you'll see links that looks like that little open house picture, and it takes you to a whole open house kit. All of those examples are there to click on. It's good stuff. Thank you, Brandy, for gathering that. You don't have to do everything. You can do some of the things, but all of those are great ways of making the open house successful. Let's allow just a couple minutes for questions, and then we'll come back with more questions at the end of the period here. Questions for Brandy on open house for a couple minutes before we move on?
Only question that I have is regarding the extra helper bonus. I didn't quite understand what we were saying there.
I'm glad that you asked that question. So it's thinking about different meeting roles. So if we were hosting a speech contest, we would have a Zoom master, a senior sergeant at arms. So having someone in your club meeting who is really comfortable with facilitating an open house meeting, where they're able to put people into a breakout room if necessary. So if you wanted to pull a few people in and have follow-up conversations with some of your guests, having someone who's comfortable with admitting people into the meeting, comfortable with removing people from the meeting should the occasion require, and we know we've seen that within our district. So it doesn't necessarily have to be your sergeant at arms, but someone who is very comfortable as a Zoom master, someone who's really able to help to facilitate and make the meeting go easy so that the person who is facilitating the meeting, the Toastmaster, is able to be focused on that. And then similarly, like I said, a greeter, it could be your VP of membership, or someone who's able to connect, who's really reaching out to everybody who was there. Depending upon the size of your meeting, if I had a pre-registration list, I was reconciling during my meeting. If I'm looking through it, I'm saying, okay, Lou signed up. I see that he's here. So I would know when people would come in that I would say, oh, Christy didn't pre-register. I definitely want to try to connect with Christy and see if I could get her contact information, because I want to be able to follow up with her after the meeting. So having someone who's not necessarily participating in a normal meeting role, but who's able to reach out and connect with people. I think of it like in a club meeting setting. If we had a guest, I would typically want to go sit near the guest, be able to explain the meeting rules. If you have any questions, feel free to ask me about it. So having someone who's reached out to them, so maybe they feel a little more comfortable about saying, hey, what is a grammarian? You know, that you've had someone who's made that connection. Each club is going to be a little bit different as far as the different things you do. We tried to do a drawing lesson learned, but you know, having someone who was there who's facilitating the drawing. So depending upon the different things you try to do in a meeting, it's thinking about those roles that may not be a traditional Toastmaster meeting role itself.
Okay, so what I hear you saying is that these people are your backups and your reinforcement.
Absolutely. And I think it, like I said, absolutely like a contest, that you want to have people there. If you're able to get resources from outside your club, if your club's not large enough, who could be able to fill in some of those roles so that your club members could be actively engaged in leading the roles, the people that you would see when they came back for the next meeting who were engaged in that. So if you're able to borrow a friend to facilitate these other roles, now certainly you can do it within the club itself. You certainly can limit the number of the roles. I just say it's just depending upon the skill set within your club as to who's in what role.
Right, and it may be, again, like the Zoom master, the behind the scenes, what Deepa's doing to manage the people coming in the room and quiet people and making the slideshow is a busy role, right? Those people that have done that in a contest, you know, you're just a zooming away. It's not only Zoom for the tool, but Zoom for your time in that meeting. And you may want another helper in that role. But let us move on, if we may. We'll come back and have some time for questions throughout. But I want to cover, this is a bit of a smorgasbord of really great tips because there are other topics. Thank you so much, Brandy. I think the fact that we have all of those tips on the website makes this really a valuable tool. We should see open houses coming in on a regular basis. We have a promotion going on for the whole year. Every club is eligible once a quarter. So every 3 months you can do it again. As if you bring an open house with 2 new members within that month of the open house, we have $25 in bookstore bucks for you. Let Brandy know. Is open house chair, open house at d50tm.org, or check out the website and you'll see all the emails.